Why are there so many podcasts about Tottenham? Do I want to know why? They might contain insight, but mostly delusions. If I hear one more, I might die. They don't like Levy and they don't like Enoch. They pine for Moo and Conte. Someday we'll like 'em, old Tottenham Hotspur.
Hello and welcome to Season 2 of Poddenham Podspur, the Tottenham Hotspur podcast about Tottenham Hotspur podcasts. My name is Ian and today I'm going to be talking about your favourite Spurs pod and how I figured it out. Maybe. Depending on how you define favourite or Spurs pod and how much of a podcast hipster you might be. If you're new to the show and you want to follow us on social media, you can find the show on Bluesky at poddenhampodspur.bsky.social, myself at ian.coys.social, or you can email the show at poddenhampodspur@gmail.com, and we will be coming to other social media platforms in the coming future. If you are new to the podcast and you haven't listened and you don't know who I am, let me just give you a quick introduction. I am a Spurs fan, approaching his 40s. I've been listening to podcasts for 15 years, so I feel like I've got a pretty good sense about what a Spurs podcast is and isn't. And so a few months ago on Bluesky, I put out a joke saying, hey, why don't we have a Spurs podcast about Spurs podcasts? Because there are so many of them. And it seemed to strike a chord with people. I created the pod and I've spent the last few months digging into the sort of culture of Spurs fandom through the lens of Spurs podcasts. And it's been a pretty good ride. I am not a journalism graduate. I'm not a social media expert. I'm just a guy with too much time on his hands who listens to dozens of Spurs podcasts per week and tries to cobble together something which is a mostly sensible take on what's happening in the Spurs fandom at any one time. So, because I'm not necessarily an expert, I felt like I needed to do some analysis to try to figure out what is actually Spurs fans' most popular or most listened to podcast or sort of content creation. Because I have my favorites and you have your own favorites, right? And as the sort of self-defined judge and jury of Spurs podcasts, I need to be aware of my own biases. And trust me, as a nearly 40-year-old Spurs fan, I'm very aware of my own foibles. But my listening habits have started from one place, which was predominantly the Fighting Cock, 15 years ago, and has perhaps evolved from that starting point, from that seed. So I'd like to know how my selections of what I listen to regularly and what I've talked about on this show compare to the general Spurs fan audience. And coming into the start of season 2, it's a good time. It's a good time for me to check my biases and start as I mean to go on, which is as expansive as I can be of the Spurs fandom. I'd also like to celebrate some wins, which pods are thriving, which are maybe flying under the radar a little bit, or at least my radar. I'm aware also of the video side of Spurs fan content creation and how big it is, but I don't really listen to it on the regular. So I wanted to use a sort of survey of the landscape of Spurs podcasts and Spurs fan content being put into the video formats so that I can better understand them moving forward. I'd also like to know how many people are perhaps listening per week to Spurs podcasts, if possible, and just how many Spurs pods there are. So as you can maybe gather, talking about what is Spurs fans' most favourite podcast is going to be quite an information-heavy topic. And so this whole podcast episode here might be better as a blog. And apologies in advance if it's a little rambly or maybe there's some gaps for things that you're interested in. If there are questions from the audience, fire them to me on social media or to the Gmail, and maybe I can do a follow-up, or maybe I can do a live stream of looking through my tables on Excel of the data that I've amassed to try to answer this question of Tottenham Hotspur's most popular podcast. Before I dive in, I just want to talk a little bit about some semantics and definitions. So I've used the word podcast a lot here because, again, my bias has been towards audio forward podcasts, those which don't have a heavy YouTube or TikTok presence, because that's just what aligns with my listening style. I tend to do it while I work, make some notes, go on from there, listen in the car, that type of stuff. I don't tend to have the time to sit down and watch some of these multi-hour YouTube videos, and some of them just don't speak to me as sort of content creators, because I feel like I've developed an affinity towards the audio format. But we do have these shows like, The Fighting Cock or The View from the Lane, which are predominantly audio podcasts. You'll find them on Apple, Spotify, Podcast Addict, Pocket Casts, whatever you use to listen. But we also have this side of things where people are recording themselves on Zoom chats or whatever and putting them only onto YouTube, and those are also sometimes called podcasts. These are more video podcasts, in my opinion. So I will be talking about both of them today. We also have the differences between podcasters and YouTubes and personalities and content creators and influencers. And again, today I'm going to be mostly inclusive. There are some people who I consider them to be kind of more influencers than podcasters, and that's perhaps why I don't listen to them too much, or they're big personalities first. And that would be somebody like ExpressionsOozing. I think I would sort of classify more as a YouTuber or a personality as opposed to a podcaster, but I'm going to be talking about that channel today. And then we have channels versus podcasts, right? So you have a sort of a classical podcast definition for me is somebody who puts out a show once or twice a week. It's audio forward. It's a deep dive conversation between just a few people, and it's usually regular folks talking to each other on a singular topic. And then you have channels, in my opinion, like something like We Are Tottenham TV or Spurs Kings TV on YouTube, where you might have multiple people coming in to host on the regular. They're putting out a decent amount of content per day. Especially on YouTube, you might see upwards of 5-10 videos from the same channel in a day, and sometimes it might be just a few minutes, sometimes it might be a few hours. So again, there's a difference there, and we're all inclusive. So some creators are primarily video, somebody like Ben Bowman on his tactics videos. Some shows are primarily audio, and I'm going to be talking about both. And does it really matter? In the grand scheme of things, not particularly. This is all just for fun, just to try to get generally a pulse on Spurs fandom. But it is important for me, as the person doing this show, to be aware of where my gaps might be, and where I perhaps need to focus more attention in the future. So I needed a starting point to figure out what is our favorite podcast. And that starting point for me was just how many active Tottenham podcasts there are right now. So to do this, I quilted together multiple targeted keyword searches. It's a lot of big, awful words, but basically I did a lot of searches on Google, on Apple, on Spotify, on Podcast Addict, on Listen Notes, on wherever, for sort of keywords associated with Spurs. Tottenham, Spurs, Hotspur, COYS, Lillywhite, Lane, those types of things, to start to gather a list of podcasts. And I added as I researched, so as I would search for one thing, something else would pop up. And so I eventually just kind of developed out to what I think is a pretty mostly comprehensive list of Spurs podcasts. I also used some other sources. I found that, especially for the YouTube space, Spurs Kings TV recently ran a Tottenham YouTube Content Awards with a bunch of different nominees for each category, and I used that as well as a launch pad to identify video forward shows. So in total, after spending some time gathering all this over the last, I want to say 4 weeks, I found about 179, 180 or so audio and video forward podcasts or shows talking exclusively or predominantly about Tottenham Hotspur, which is just a kind of mind-blowing number. But that's the total. And not all of these, as far as I can tell, are active. So I looked through this list of 180 or so shows and tried to find those as which are still recording, like those that have put something out in the last 6 months or so. And of that, we've got 108 active podcasts, channels, influencers, and shows in general, which is just a huge number. And I defined 53 of these as audio forward, 46 as video forward, and 8 which I called hybrid. Basically, I couldn't really decide if they were more of an audio forward or a video forward format. You know, somebody like Chris Cowlin's Spurs Chat, which is on both places, has huge numbers everywhere. Like, it's hard to call it one or the other. So with 108 active Spurs podcasts, in the umbrella sense of the term podcast, if we assume an average of like 2 episodes per week, conservatively, you know, some of these shows might only put once a week, others are putting out 10 per day. So I just arbitrarily chose 2 as something that felt right to me. And again, an average of approximately, 1 hour. I think we have something like 216 hours of Spurs content being put out every week, or 9 days of non-stop Spurs podcasts being recorded. Lord, I hope those numbers work out correctly, but it's just kind of a mind-blowing number. You know, we have more hours of Spurs content being recorded per week than there are actually days in a week. It just shows you the level of fanaticism and love that we have for this absolutely insane football club that treats us so well and so poorly. So with this starting point of these 108 active podcasts, I then needed to figure out which was the most popular. And for this, I want to give a huge thanks to a few people up front, because without them, I don't think this would have been quite as interesting as it has become. The first person I want to thank is Anyong333 over on Reddit for very kindly emailing me their r/COYS subreddit survey data. So Anyong runs an end-of-season survey every year for the last few years with a whole bunch of questions in a Google form for Reddit users to fill out. Things like player ratings, season ratings, favorite players, where we need to strengthen, where we need to weaken, demographic data like where they live, how long they've been a Spurs fan. But most importantly for this show, they also were asked what their favorite podcasters are. So I reached out to Anyong333 on Reddit, introduced myself, and kindly, sort of politely asked, may I have access to this? And they sent me a huge Excel file with just a massive volume of data from about 400 to 500 respondents. So a very sort of comprehensive look into the heart of the Spurs fan base, or at least part of the Spurs fan base. You know, we can get at some point into the differences between, Reddit versus Twitter versus match-going fans versus Bluesky versus whoever. But that was a huge help in terms of figuring out and corroborating some of the other data that I've amassed. I also want to thank Spurs Kings TV for running their Tottenham YouTube Content Awards, which was just at the start of this month. I think they announced the winners, and that was a great listen. I'm going to link the show in my show notes. Thank you to Ash and everybody at Spurs Kings for that. Like I said, it was very useful in terms of verifying my feelings and outcomes of the data, but also for identifying popular channels. And finally, I want to thank Owen, Own Brand over on Bluesky, for inviting Poddenham Podspur to have a question to the Bluesky audience on their favourite podcast. And as a result of that, although it was a limited set of 4 that I chose, it still, again, all helps to painting a picture of what Spurs fans like in different places. So what is the most popular Spurs podcast? Simple question. with about 100 different answers. And right off the bat, before I really get into this, what I want to say is the most popular Spurs podcast is whatever you like, right? We all like something different. But more accurately, from a video forward standpoint, this is pretty easy to quantify. YouTube, TikTok, etc. very helpfully list subscribers and likes. They're also the hub for video content. You don't have dozens of different places which are all, entirely separate. We also have views per episode available here. It's harder to quantify audio forward podcasts. Several middle-aged men chatting over Zoom and then putting up their stuff onto Spotify. Because the RSS feeds which are used to send out podcast episodes to all the different audio platforms that you might listen to aren't capable of sending that data back and centralizing it and getting one nice clean number for how many podcasts are listened to by how many people. So we have to use tertiary data because podcast players don't necessarily share their listening data for us to go in and amass. So for this, I used Apple, Spotify, podcast data, Castbox Addict, subs, stuff like that. Podcast Database is another place that I was able to take data from. This estimates listeners, but it's approximate. For example, Wheeler Dealer Radio, they say has 25 listeners per episode, but I believe it's predominantly influenced by their recent hiatus. Another place, tertiary data, where I gathered information from was Listen Notes, a very interesting website. It produces a proprietary score between 0 and 100 using a very opaque mathematical model. And so they generate their score between 0 and 100, where 100 is the most popular and 0 is the least popular, using their own website data, media mentions, stuff like that. And it's best seen as kind of a relative score. So to compare between podcasts, this was quite useful. Raphonic is available, but it's not free. The podcast database, as I mentioned, is limited for free users. We also have Podchaser, Podcast Hawk, Podengine have scores, but as far as I can tell, they're all kind of doing the same thing. So I just settled on Listen Notes because that was the first one I used, and I didn't feel like digging into it too deeply. I just needed something to align with all my other information. However, I couldn't source consistent data for every single podcast. It was easy for the big pods, the ones that are very well listened to, but Listen Note scores weren't available for some of the podcasts which were a little bit smaller. And for example, over on the podcast database, this show I think was listed as having 0 listeners, which isn't true. So, it's not a million, but it's in the hundreds, not in the thousands, and it's not, in the dozens. So, other indirect methods I used also included looking at X, formerly Twitter, and Instagram followers. Again, just to get a big picture. So overall, if we separate into audio and video podcasts, the most popular video podcast is looking at YouTube views. Chris Cowlin's Spurs Chat. 139 million views, 178,000 subscribers. It's a huge number. Chris Cowlin was also named the GOAT and Best Tottenham Channel in Spurs Kings TV's YouTube Content Awards. Just underscoring sort of the importance that Chris has in that YouTube space. We Are Tottenham TV, 133 million views, 183,000 likes. ExpressionsOozing, 124 million views, 410,000 subs. So, that underscores the more relative emergence of expressions, I guess, compared to some of these other places. And in fourth, we have George Acchilea and Alasdair Gold in fifth with 16 million each. So you see a large drop-off between expressions in third, and then George and Alasdair in fourth and fifth. And Expressions was also named funniest creator in the Spurs Kings TV survey. So yeah, Chris Cowlin, We Are Tottenham TV, Expressions are the big players over in the YouTube space. And, I enjoy We Are Tottenham TV enough. Chris Cowlin I dip into every now and then because, they tend to have sort of interesting people come on every now and then. Expressions is not necessarily somebody that I tune into I've tried. Yeah, it just doesn't work with me, but I do know a number of people around here in the supporters club that I go to who do listen to Expressions regularly and enjoy his content. If we look at TikTok, we also have Barnaby Slater, who hosts the daily Spurred On podcast, has 18 million views. Expressions has 12 million views. Ben Bowman has 11 million views. And in fourth, we have George Acchilea with, I think it's something like 1 million views. And TikTok is sort of a newer platform, as you're aware, and their influence is sort of generally unknown to me. And the impressions they make on the fan base and their cultural impact is certainly interesting. But maybe as I as I move into my middle age, this will be harder for me to ascertain. But they're certainly creating new voices, which I think is always a good thing. To diversify out what's being said about Spurs, what's being considered and reflected and echoed. A special mention for Twitch, because this was, again, just a complete black hole for me. Twitch, I completely just think of it as like a gaming streaming site. But Yummy_2 was a nominee for best live streams in the Spurs Kings TV survey. And Yummy has 42,000 Twitch followers, which is the largest of the people that I was able to review. Seems to have gotten famous around the Europa League final and some excitement that she shared on there. I hope I'm using pronouns correctly. Hope I'm reflecting their content correctly. Seems to be a reaction person. We also have Johnny H of Talking Tottenham, who has 33,000 Twitch followers. And then the numbers kind of taper off pretty quickly from there. So, video, all done. Moving on to audio pods. The top here is pretty straightforward. I want you to think for a second about what you think the most popular Spurs pod is. Just going to give you like 2 seconds, 3 seconds. All right. It's the Fighting Cock. Did you guess it right? That's what I thought going into this. And the data confirms it. Across every metric that I assessed, the Fighting Cock was miles ahead of their sort of second place in the r/COYS data, in review scores or review numbers on Apple, Spotify, the Listen Notes score, which was 58, placing it above some of our top 6 rivals like Red Men TV, which had a score of 55, a Liverpool channel, Talk of the Devils, 52, Man United channel. And those two seem to be the biggest of those two fan bases as far as I can tell. But it seemed to be lower than London is Blue, Chelsea, so they had a score of 60, and also the Arsblog, Arscast. That was horrible to say. Fuck you guys. Which had a score of 67, and as you might have guessed, that's a Gooner pod. And so, yeah, I'll come back to that in a moment. Fighting Cock also had a podcast database score of 39,700 listeners, which I think might be an underestimate. Last Word on Spurs self-reports at roughly 40 to 50,000 per week, which again I think is an old number. But if we assume a nice round figure of something like 50,000 listeners per pod, per episode, the Fighting Cock would need to release 2,780 episodes to match the total YouTube views of Chris Cowlin. So the video space has a huge cultural impact, potentially. Which is interesting because when I think of the Fighting Cock, that's one of the first things that comes to mind is their cultural impact through memes, through their sort of crowd involvement, through platforming other people and creating new spaces, or helping them create new spaces within Spurs fan content creation, whether that be photographers or other podcasters, whoever. So yeah, they need to release nearly 3,000 episodes to get up to Chris Cowlin's huge astronomical numbers. So, and Google says they've released 773, not including the lab or special Patreon episodes. So yeah, they got some work to do. Figuring out the number 2 is a bit trickier because Last Word on Spurs and the Spurs Show both have similar listen notes and podcast database scores, but very different Apple, Spotify, and Castbox review counts. Plus, the Last Word on Spurs YouTube channel is huge. So it's kind of difficult. And there's a very popular Spurs Show sort of fan base. What I found interesting was that the Spurs Show has a very high listen notes and podcast database score, but their Spotify and Apple review counts are actually very low relative to other high-ranking podcasts, sort of suggesting that people are listening, but not necessarily like engaging with the sort of meta internet narrative of the Spurs Show, despite them having such a very interesting in-person experience for people through their live shows. So, if we were to say the Fighting Cock, Last Word on Spurs, and Spurs Show are roughly the top 3 or thereabouts in terms of the audio podcast forward shows. And again, Last Word on Spurs being in there because of their heavy YouTube presence is kind of tricky. But if I look at the r/COYS end of season survey, so this roundup of 2024 and 2025 data, consistently it's been the Fighting Cock, the Extra Inch, and View from the Lane that comes out in Reddit preferences at least. And again, polling is subjective, and who you talk to and what they tell you is not necessarily reflective of millions of people. But again, I think this maybe speaks to how people vote and what people say is their preferred podcast and what they actually listen to from week to week maybe don't align 100%. Hello, future Ian here. In this next little section, I'm talking about the View from the Lane and the Extra Inch, and I say the podcast database score. What I meant to say was the listen notes score. So, slap on the wrist for me. Apologies for the confusion. But the data roughly syncs up. Anyway, back to the pod. The Extra Inch and the View from the Lane, both very good podcasts, do pop up next in the podcast database ranking, so they're certainly up there. But it's kind of a number one, and then maybe sort of 4 pods below them, all vying for the second spot. If there's any competition to be had here, which I don't think there is. I think there's plenty of space for all of this. The next little area that I wanted to look at was the most popular American podcasts. I live in America, so this was a personally interesting question. And, there's an obvious and logical domination of the English podcasts in this space. Tottenham is in the capital of London, after all, right? But looking into the r/COYS data, which, admittedly is biased, there were more respondents from the US than the UK. We're talking who identified themselves as being from the US or the UK. There were a number of people who didn't give location data. 140 people versus 136. And if I look at the USA-based people, they overwhelmingly favoured the Fighting Cock. So they're looking for that, authentic, or at least authentically presented Tottenham experience. People who talk about fans, who have boots on the ground. I think they're looking for that. As opposed to something like the journalism perspective from The Athletic or The Tottenham Way or Alasdair Gold or somebody. But, sort of American podcasts talking about an English club, there's a sort of a couple that came out of the list. Dr. Tottenham was number 1, albeit they are a mix of US and UK-based hosts. I think they were formerly, the name of their pod was an American podcast, I believe. Identified them as an American podcast. And then we had Wheeler Dealer Radio. So both of these had listen note scores in the 40s, which put them as the sort of top 2 American Spurs pods. Interestingly, Dr. Tottenham was named the second best international Spurs channel behind the Irish Hotspur, who, in my opinion, sort of predominantly focus on matchday reactions and sort of watch-alongs and things like that. And I quite enjoy the Irish Hotspur's content when I do tune in. And just for comparison, I've thrown out numbers for lots of other podcasts here. I've already said approximately how many my listeners are, which is, low. My podcast is hovering around the 30 mark in the listen notes score. So I don't want to be just kind of throwing stones at other people and not having it come back at me. That's my number. So, does any of this matter, right? Like, yes, there are lots of different podcasts, and yes, there are lots of different people listening. Does it mean anything? Are we a monolith? Are there noticeable differences between podcasts in terms of who's listening and what they're thinking and feeling about Spurs? As I mentioned, the r/COYS data is very interesting because you had hundreds of people responding and you got demographics out of it. And also things like season ratings, how they feel about Ange, stuff like that. And so, yes, maybe there are differences in the listener base, or at least those people who identify themselves as predominantly sort of fans of one pod over another, or having a preference for one pod over another. And so looking at the top 5 pods from the r/COYS data, which, we're getting into dozens of respondents for some of these because the Fighting Cock was such a large presence in the Reddit data. Again, unsurprising, that seems to be one of the few podcasts who were allowed to actually post their shows onto the main subreddit feed as opposed to somewhere else and have it deleted, just in my experience, and things that I've read from others online. But yeah, we're skirting the edge of sort of good, robust data here, but let's look at some trends. So looking at the top 5 pods, which were the Fighting Cock, the Extra Inch, View from the Lane, anything involving Alasdair Gold, and The Game is About Glory. I found that some of those podcasts were skewing slightly older. The Game is About Glory, Alasdair Gold, View from the Lane. I'd also note that View from the Lane and The Game is About Glory were the top 2, almost tied for first in the Bluesky survey or awards that Owen ran earlier this year. Maybe saying something about those of us who predominantly use Bluesky. And some podcasts skewed a little younger, like the Extra Inch. And then looking at how long people have been listening, it seems like perhaps there's a trend for the Fighting Cock and Alasdair Gold to be more starter pods. They had a slight enrichment. Again, nothing statistical here, just using my kind of portfolio analysis brain to look at the data and eyeball it. There seemed to be a little bit of a bump in the Fighting Cock and Alasdair Gold's listeners who've been sort of Spurs fans for less than 6 years. They also had different players that they preferred. So overall, looking at all the respondents in the survey, Porro, followed by Bergvall, followed by Kulusevski were the sort of top 3. But if you look at the Extra Inch, their favourite player was James Maddison, by quite some way, if I remember correctly. The Game is About Glory was tied between Porro, Madders, and Brennan Johnson, surprisingly. Much to probably Milo's delight there. No Spence. Sorry, Milo. But most interesting for me was looking at how they viewed last season, the 24-25 season. And for this, Anyong asked some questions about whether the respondents were Ange in, Ange indifferent, Ange out, Ange in because of the trophy. They also asked about their view on performance in Europe, performance in the Premier League, and a whole bunch of different questions. But I just zoomed in on the Ange in, Ange out sort of spectrum, as well as performance in the league and performance in Europa, because I thought these were kind of the main 3 questions coming out of last season. And if we look at The Game is About Glory, they were mostly Ange in, which was sort of strikingly obvious in the sort of few dozen people that identified them as their favourite podcast. And were higher in general on performance in the league and in Europa than other podcasts. The Extra Inch, on the other hand, were mostly Ange indifferent, but tied with Alasdair Gold, preferers for the most sort of negative about our league performance. But their Europa sort of resembled the aggregate. And again, maybe this speaks to the influence of the podcasts and how they're packaging and presenting the events which are happening on the pitch and off the pitch, I guess. And how people are sort of absorbing that data and incorporating it into their own worldview. On the other hand, you might have some gatekeeping. You're not going to listen to The Game is About Glory if you think they're happy clappers. You're not going to think about listening to the Extra Inch if you think they're just Ange haters for no good reason, right? So there's some gatekeeping involved. And I think when you talk about the influence of fans on the podcast and podcast on the fans, it really depends on how large the podcast is. I feel like you can say somewhat comfortably that the Fighting Cock are somewhat sort of tastemakers and fan base shapers because of their size and popularity and the sort of spread of their worldview throughout the sort of Spurs online fandom, at least, as we saw with the Could We meme that came about last year. Every now and then a small podcast, might break through and capture the zeitgeist, but the Fighting Cock seems to do it sort of somewhat regularly. I also just want to highlight that View from the Lane had the highest Ange out response, which again I think speaks to the type of people listening to View from the Lane. They were quite down on Ange, especially at the end of the last season. And very interesting that that's a journalist podcast. All right. So what have I learned? Well, the first thing is that I have a lot more shows that I have to listen to. I haven't written down the numbers, but I probably listened to something like 20, 30 different pods in the last couple of months. And that's maybe a quarter of everything that's being put out. Can I justify running a podcast about podcasts if I'm missing a huge cultural impact of especially video forward podcasts? So, I don't know. I'll keep doing it for as long as it's fun. I do find video overwhelming to keep pace with. These tend to be longer. They tend to release more per day. There's an awful lot of non-audio cues, so you have to pay more attention if you're sort of actually reviewing and trying to think critically about what's being put in front of you. So I think I might just try to justify my own bullshit by focusing only on the audio format and shorter pods. I'd love to know what people think about that approach and the kind of cultural differences of audio forward versus video forward podcasts. Because I do have some pilot data from the r/COYS stuff confirming that different pod listeners maybe do see the game slightly differently. The trends are all in one direction, but there are some nuance there. So listening to different spaces and trying to bring that all together, I think is somewhat important. Maybe somebody can do it better than me. And yeah, I was surprised that the largest Spurs audio forward podcast, The Fighting Cock, which, I've been listening to for a long time myself, might be slightly smaller in scale than its most, the most popular top 6 rival podcasts. I mentioned a few. I did notice in my Manchester United review before the Europa League final that when I was looking for Man United pods, there were just far fewer than Spurs overall. And I haven't done this analysis in deep yet. I'm thinking about it. But I am curious to know whether or not this is because the fan bases of some of these other clubs are larger, or if there's just more total Spurs podcasts absorbing listeners from the top 4 or 5. They're picking off thousands at a time, but it's enough to skew the data. And so finally, just to really just wrap up, just a thought experiment that I thought might be interesting is whether or not someone can knock the Fighting Cock and Chris Cowlin off of their perches atop of the audio and video podcast spaces. The fan base, I feel like, is increasingly balkanized between social media platforms, at least the online fan base, between different podcasts and different video platforms that they're watching and listening to. But, it's quite impressive that the Fighting Cock has managed to stay at the top for as long as they have for that reason. And fight off other long-standing Spurs pods that they have good relationships with. I'm not trying to imply anything here. So, for Chris Cowlin, I see the work that he puts in. and the effort and this kind of reach that he tries to go for. But I do think it's kind of slightly more possible. I look at the emergence of creators like Expressions or Barnaby Slater and their influence on TikTok in such a short period of time. I feel like that the emergence of that type of influencer, content creator, whatever you want to call them, it suggests that, Chris's spot as number one in the YouTube space may not be forever. I think Expressions especially is rapidly catching up on him. And Barnaby did get some plaudits through the Spurs Kings TV survey awards for, I think, sort of best new creator. So somebody to keep an eye on. But anybody who comes in is to sort of scale up to the top of the mountain, as it were, would probably need to have some sort of broad, reach, an ability to reach across different demographics. They probably need to be somewhat established. Like I said earlier, like the way that the Fighting Cock has helped lift up other podcasts, especially sort of the Extra Inch, it suggests that having an established foothold in some kind of social media or other space is a big boost. And if you want to have lots of people listening, you need to be as kind of broad and inclusive as possible, and also just put out a really, really good product. I think that's kind of an understated fact of all of these pods I've spoken about today. They're putting out, really sort of high quality work in the spaces that they're working within. So do I think that anybody's going to take the Fighting Cock's spot or Chris Cowlin's spot in the next year? I don't think so. But I think it's going to be interesting to see how this changes over the next couple of years. So this was fun. I don't know if that came across in the recording, but this was like a lot of work. I've learned a lot. I found some podcasts that I've never heard of before that I'm excited to check out and talk to you guys about. I found some video channels that I feel like might align with what I enjoy about, Spurs podcasts, which is probably a topic for another day. But I just want to underscore that just because some of these podcasts are the most popular doesn't mean that they're the best for you or that you have to listen to them. I hear a lot of complaints online and some in person that there are too many. It's kind of in my show intro song that there are so many podcasts about Tottenham and why. But I think for as long as people are putting out interesting spins on this on this topic, they're coming in with alternative views, their alternative voices, I think this is a good thing. As long as we don't get, a bunch of clones popping up and creating more of the same, talking points from the larger pods, I think is good if we start spreading out broader. I do think looking through the show, I do wish that there were more women's voices generally in this podcast space. It's, as you might expect, very male dominated. I didn't talk about N17 women today. They predominantly talk about the women's team, and I didn't feel like it was fair to wrap them up into this analysis, which is predominantly focused on the men's team. It's kind of an apples to oranges comparison in terms of just the starting point of interest that people have in the men's team versus the women's team, unfortunately. But they're putting out great work, and I hope to talk about them in the next few weeks. But yeah, I just think just looking through the list of podcasts and seeing who's on them, I do wish that we had more women's voices just present and just sort of given their perspective. So yeah, so thanks for listening. I hope I got everything in. There were lots of different things that I couldn't find a way to sort of neatly and elegantly fit with my running order. I want to give a shout out to the Crowing Cockerel, who are a new podcast. I was very surprised to see that they are doing great numbers over on YouTube for a podcast that's, I think, on its maybe fourth episode, and they're already up to nearly 15,000 views or something on YouTube. Good for them. That's one of these sort of new voices who are obviously putting out a product which people are enjoying. That's really impressive. keep making them. Keep bringing new Spurs podcasts to me. Let's see if we can get this, 108 or whatever it was up to 200 by the end of the season. let's have a Spurs podcast for every single micro niche that we can possibly imagine, and just see which one is the most popular. Right? That'd be a kind of fun and stupid experiment. Maybe a waste of everybody's time. Speaking of wasting time, I'm wrapping up. I'm trying to stretch this out in case anything pops into my mind palace. But I'm looking forward to bringing you guys some fun stuff in the coming months as we enter a new era under Thomas Frank. I'll be paying attention to how some of these podcasts have pivoted from Ange to Mr. Frank. Quantify the excitement. I think the incoming Fabio Paratici, might be interesting to look at how different podcasts are handling and expressing excitement or trepidation about him coming back into a formal role within the club. I have very strong feelings about that, so I feel like that'll be a fun podcast to do. Some regular touch base, where we are at with like fan base stuff, all sorts of stuff. I've got some nice ideas for the coming year. If you've enjoyed listening, thank you. Thank you for tuning in. I appreciate everybody who listens to me ramble. I'm, just a dude with a microphone. I'm nothing more exciting than that, sadly. If you want to come on the show, I'm always happy to bring people in. We've done a few focus podcasts on the Spurs show already. I've done the Rule the Roost, but if you want to come on and talk about a podcast with me, please do. I just like talking to people about stuff within the Spurs fan base that people have created. And that's what I like about podcasts so much. Please share with your friends. Leave me a like wherever you happen to have found me. A review would be great, as long as it's positive. Of course, you can be honest. But, positive is always good. I'm a smaller channel looking to grow. And yeah, keep making Spurs podcasts. Keep listening to them. Keep telling me about them. Follow me on Blue Sky at Poddenham Podspur. And come on, you Spurs.